This is a slightly different take on the Spanish discussion we had earlier today. And basically, I'm like, how could you think about it? If you assume that Spain wants to reach a 20% of power consumption should come from renewables, you can think that there's hydro in place that takes a part of that, and then you have wind in place, and then there's actually quite transparent pipeline for wind capacity that is quite attractive in Spain. So if you take that, you basically end up with 29 terawatt hours that you somehow have to find, right? And then what we did here is kind of like run different scenarios just to see where do you end up. So the first one says if there's a strong support for biomass, which by the way I believe is very unlikely. Biomass has a lot of supply chain issues and cost issues as well. But then you would kind of end up with a remainder, and here we said that basically the remainder will be split evenly based on the current objectives between CSP and PV, the two other remaining options, and you would get to something as low as 160 megawatt a year. Now, if you assume a strong CSP support, which basically says that we're going to do historic biomass, and I think for PV, we just said like we're going to double our objective here to 2.4 gigawatt. Then you get to 350 megawatt a year for PV. Now, when you say like, look, we actually want to focus more on the PV side, you would need something like 1.2 gigawatt at the end of the day if you want to fill that gap. Now, this is the chart I think all of you have been waiting for. Here's what we did about a year ago when we started our knowledge, and if we actually said, look, there are a lot of demand projections out there, and while we all know one for sure is that we're going to be wrong, we said there's actually a lot of merit in developing a bottoms-up model, and our model is based on the cost projection you've seen, but also on kind of like end customer economics for residential, commercial, and then we've made some assumptions for policy demand as well. But base point here is that in our base case, which I personally actually believe is a little bit conservative, we're kind of like seeing 6.5 gigawatt maybe for 2010, and a total cumulative installed of 160 gigawatt by 2020. But when you look at it, when you step back and look at it, it's still very attractive growth rates, by the way. For a lot of other industries would be quite jealous to get this. Now, I think in one of your emails, Edwin, you asked for what is kind of like a more aggressive case here. So here's kind of like where we say like what could happen. So something like an 8 gigawatt by 2010 is a little bit more aggressive, and something like 40 plus gigawatt by 2020. And you would have to believe probably two things in the short term, that there would be additional policy programs, and maybe something like Mexico, Australia, India could be markets that could make that up over the next 2 or 3 years. And then I do believe that utilities, including PV in their rate base, will have a multiplier effect and give scale to the demand. And then in the medium and long term, there is something around the climate change debate where China could go down a route and embrace solar. And then there's something else here where utility actually say we want to increase the penetration of solar, really maximize the unique advantage that solar brings on a DG base as well as central, and then kind of like optimize the grid that they manage, and then you would also get significantly higher output. But that is probably a little bit more long term. I think this page is pretty straightforward. I mean, the basic story is we already know Southern Europe, but I do believe that if you want to succeed in this market, you have to be in the US, basically. I do believe. Now, I do want to make two other final points here. One is that different customer segments have different economics, different price points, and this is an example. I actually don't know if it is SB 15 in California or if it's the node in Texas, but it basically shows you the buildup of power prices. It's peak adjusted, so you have a wholesale price during peak demand of 7 cents. Then a commercial industrial customer would have to pay transmission and some distribution charges, so they usually pay 11 cents. And then we as residential end customers pay a little bit more on the distribution side, and then there's also a load shaping premium that we would have to pay for. So it gets down to 15 cents. But I think this is quite relevant when you think about where's your sweet spot. Because if you do enter the left side of the market, you have a higher bar that you have to meet. Obviously, there are trade-offs between the economics on the one side and then the scalability. And I personally think there's actually a nice sweet spot when you look at the C&I customers. It's a very, very big market. Then one last page, which you may have seen before, kind of like, where do we expect grid parity? And we look at this. This page shows the different markets along two dimensions. One is the solar installation, and the other one is the power prices. This is on the retail side. You can actually draw this for commercial customers and wholesale customers, and basically apply the previous chart to this. And it's actually quite different. The relationships are not always the same, but for different markets, it's quite different. But what you see here is that some markets on the top right side, depending if you can get prices at that level, will reach grid parity rather sooner than later. And the key point is once you get to a system price of $4, there are quite a few markets opening up. Particularly if you then think that this is today's point of view. In 2 or 3 years, it might look quite differently, certainly on the residential side and to some extent on the commercial side. Time of use pricing will be also a big driver that is worthwhile to understand where that is happening in which markets. It basically means that unlike me now paying 15 cents for 24 hours, there will be somebody who will offer me 30 cents for 6 hours of the day and then 10 cents for the remainder of the day. And that could happen as early as 1 to 2 years in the States. So maybe, in closing, a couple of, the key themes here. One is we see significant cost reduction potential. We see the trends on the power markets being quite favorable for solar. And we see the need for developing economic demand. This will not be as easy as the markets that players are currently participating in Europe. It'll be much more complicated and complex. But there is a significant upside here. Thank you.